Hi, this is Welcome to Stories and Spoilers, the podcast. My name is Alyssa. I'm your host, and I'm so happy to be here with an amazing therapist as we dive into mental health in literature, as well as just in writing in general, good representation, anxiety representation, depression representation, and book recommendations if you're interested in reading both nonfiction and fiction. Camilla, I'm so happy to have you here. Tell them more about yourself.
Hi, I'm Camilla. I have been a social worker for a little over 10 years,
Cool.
started doing therapy work in, believe it or not, 2020 at the very
Wow.
beginning. So I've basically been all online with my clients, but I've been a reader for my entire life. And so I started a little bookstagram, just including both mental health and books because I think it's so prevalent and I think every book has some sort of mental health representation, but I was really noticing lots of themes, and I'm like, I should post together. Yeah.
That is so cool. I love the combination of some people when they read stories that have really realistic elements like a pregnancy trope or depression or abuse, it pulls them out of the story, which I completely understand.
Mhm.
But there are some books out there that do it so well, like the discussion of anxiety, especially with the female main character, a male or non-binary. So many people struggle with social anxiety, anxiety linked to intimacy, be it from trauma or just, insecurity. I've always wanted to hear from a therapist point of view what a healthy representation of that is in a romance or in an adventure, where there's fantasy or there's this fluffy romance, but there's also a root of realism. And
Yeah.
I'm so excited to hear your point of view. I have
Yeah.
two book recommendations, and I can't wait to read yours and hear about yours. Everyone, I'm going to link every book we reference in the show notes below, so you can find them on Goodreads or on Amazon, and check them out yourself. So, yeah, let's hop right into it. There also is a little bit of an interview set up in this episode. So,
Mhm.
I'm going to ask you some questions listeners will be able to hear. And then from there, we'll be able to reference all the books and all the things. So, get a cozy drink, get comfy, and let's dive right into it. So, first things first, what inspired your book blog long term? Like, what really drove you to create this?
I had been posting about books, but without really any intention. So I would just post what I was reading and I would just say,
Mhm.
oh, this is what I read and here's my review. And then I was thinking to myself, I wanted to have some sort of public representation of my therapy work as well. And I'm like, well, I can tie both of those together. I
Yeah,
didn't
I
want to do
agree.
extra work because I find it hard. Social media is really hard to like limit yourself anyways. And so I didn't want to like try to maintain too many things. So I'm like, I'm going to combine my book reading and my mental health posting and kind of just put them both together. So I started doing that, I think maybe a year ago. I kind of more like rebranded myself instead of just posting every single book I read, which was a
That is
lot
so
of work
cool.
and there was no intention. I was like, I'm going to make a blog that has both of them. Yeah.
100%. Being selective about what you post. I know Bookstagram is a lot of people post exactly what they're reading. And
Hmm.
personally, for me, I like to post the things I'm really enjoying.
Yes. Yeah.
But I love when I finally read something and I'm like, oh my gosh, this character looks like me, or this character is experiencing something I experience with like
Hmm.
social anxiety. I just think it's so like I feel like I know them and like we're similar, and it also makes it feel more grounded in reality sometimes to be like, we're on an adventure and we're riding a dragon, but also I'm afraid my love interest will lose interest in me because I'm not
Yeah.
this fantastical, perfect person. I have flaws, which I saw in Kimberly Lemming's book. Um, that time I got drunk and needed a love potion on a werewolf, even though it's high fantasy, there was a
Hmm.
scene where a character admits, like, I'm so scared of you losing interest in me. I can't be on an adventure every day, and I have a job, and I want to be wanted, but also like I have a lot of second thoughts and stuff, and like attachment styles
Hmm.
in a high fantasy. That was so
Uh,
cool to read about. So
yeah.
I don't own that book, but I did read it on Kindle Unlimited. But man, I'd never heard of that before in like a story where like someone admits like I'm really scared right now, but I like you and I don't know what to do. So yeah,
Mhm.
I don't know. I was like, oh, do you have any books like that where you read it and you were like, I'm seen, or like I have clients like this.
Yes, I just finished. It's just for the summer by
Mm.
Abby Jimenez. I think hopefully I'm saying that right. I was actually like crying in that book because it was a really good example of not having the perfect parents, like having a really difficult relationship with your parents. And what I really liked about it is that she didn't try to like give the parent part like a happy ending, because like we all know, you know, you can do all the work you want, but like the other people in your life are not necessarily going to change. And so I felt like that did a really good job of having, like, it showed the attachment issues there based on like the parenting that the person had
Mhm.
received. And then, you know, the parent comes back in their life and you're like, oh, are they going to change? And then like, I
Wow.
mean, spoiler alert, but no, the parent does not change. And it's about like her having to readjust her life
Mhm.
instead. And so I thought that was like a really good example. It hit home for
Wow.
me. So I felt like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that like this is being portrayed so that people aren't, I mean, like sometimes you go into it thinking, oh, my parents are going to change if I just tell them this right thing. And it's like, no, that's really not how life works.
100%. And would you mind referencing that book one more time? Because I want to make a note of it.
Yeah, it's just for the summer.
Just for the summer. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
got it. I also think that when we read books, sometimes we think everything's gonna be wrapped up. There's always gonna be a guaranteed happy ending.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't like I like how some authors allow it to be like the person finally spoke up for themselves. That was the point, versus
Yeah.
like the villain is the parent. Well, it's not always that clear. Like there's room for fault. There's room for like people aren't perfect. Maybe your love story isn't about you and the romantic lead. Maybe the love story is about you and like the friend that was always there for you, or you and like
Mm-hmm.
your siblings kind of reconnecting. There are just so many books where I can like think off the top of my head where I'm like, the romance was great, but sometimes the real like spark or like light in the story was that consistent friendship that led to
Yeah.
the romance. I love that.
Yeah. Yeah.
There will
Yeah.
be light spoilers in this episode as well. I will reference that because we probably will touch on like why the books have certain mental health rep or
Mm-hmm.
like certain scenes that were like, oh, that hit hard, in
Mm-hmm.
a good way or in a sad way. Man, I've also heard a lot about just for the summer because I was like I know the title and I know the cover with like people like jumping into a lake and the
Yes.
sun is
Yeah.
like ooh yeah, looks fluffy
Mm-hmm.
on the outside and then you read it and you're like oh God,
Yeah.
this hurts. But sometimes you
Yeah.
need that, you know. Okay, so I love that reference. Next question: what are some of your favorite books about and why are they your favorites?
I mostly like romances. I think I have always been kind of like a hopeless romantic, and I really lean more towards the ones that do have mental health and like more realistic things going on. You know, every once in a while it's fun to just get like lost in a book that's like, you know, a cheesy romance for
That's
sure, but
true.
you know, like I love the Emily Henry style books where like they have actual things they're grappling with. The conflicts that are coming up are very realistic. So I really like those types of books. I try to do like nonfiction reading as well. So I'll
Okay.
typically have some nonfictions that I'm reading, especially ones that like I can use to reference my clients. Like I'll tell them about this book, and then I'm like, well, I should probably read the book too. You know, so I'm reading like some nonfiction, but I love romance. I will always love
I
it.
love it too. Speaking of romance, is there any recommendations you have for romances with really good mental health rep?
I do really like almost all of Emily Henry books. I feel like have done a
Okay.
really good job. I think that's why she is one of my like more favorite authors, because I feel like no matter what she's bringing up, it's always been very realistic. So I've really found myself liking a lot of hers. And I'm still like kind of branching out into like specific authors, like with Abby Jimenez. That was the only book I had read of hers actually, but I'm like I'm
Wow.
ready to dive into her because that one I read was really amazing.
Okay.
I do love Allie Hazelwood because I think she does like the comedy part of romance really well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm planning on reading Bride soon, which I'm excited to read, even though it's fantasy. I love fantasy.
Hmm.
I have heard a small spoiler that people have been saying that the main character Misery experiences a lot of isolation and
Hmm.
has maybe struggles a little bit with like self-worth. And I'm
Hmm.
like, interesting. And also, yes, she's a vampire, but like it's more like kind of the divide between family expectations versus what she really wants,
Yeah.
and kind of the boundaries and like how people struggle with boundaries. So even though it's a
Hmm.
fantasy, I'm sitting here and I'm like, you know what? I see you, Allie Hazelwood. I see you trying to touch on certain things. Also, I know that Allie Hazelwood references women in STEM a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, I know some women in STEM may feel sometimes a little isolated because of how it's a male-dominated industry. So I'm
Hmm.
like, how does that affect your mental health as well? You know, like work balance versus like your identity. So I'm like, Okay, it's getting deep.
Yeah.
It's getting
Yeah.
deep. Okay,
Yeah.
yes. So Emily Henry's a good recommendation, and Allie Hazelwood. Got it. Love it. Okay. And then where does your passion for therapy stem from? And how do you feel about books that can help folks?
I I've always wanted to help people. I think it's like, I mean, it really all stems back to childhood trauma for me, of course, as usual. But
Oof.
like a lot of people go into the field because they want to help people like they weren't
Mhm.
helped, kind of similar thing. So that's kind of how I got into the field of therapy. And then doing therapy through the pandemic was just so healing for me, as well as just like, like I was obviously helping heal people, but it felt healing for me as well because I feel like when you're doing therapy, you realize you're not alone. And I think during the pandemic, especially, we all felt really isolated and alone. And
Yeah.
so being able to like work with clients, and I'm like, no matter what I'm working through with them, we're all struggling with the same types of things.
Hmm.
So that like really got me into like, I'm just like, I love doing this. This is great. It's such a beautiful field of work. So I really love it. Yeah.
Wow, what an amazing response. Oh my gosh. I was so curious about, do you have a favorite book with mental health representation, either fiction or nonfiction? And do you have any recommendations for listeners out there who maybe want to read more about, mental health, both nonfiction where they kind of learn something directly, like statistics and quotes and things like that, or nonfiction where you're like, man, this romance or this family story, like this was really, really good to me.
Yeah, yeah. I have a couple of books that I recommend or like reference a lot in my therapy sessions. So when I have clients that are readers, I'm always like, oh, well, here, get your pen and paper because I have a couple.
Yes.
I do reference The Body Keeps the Score a lot because I feel like it goes over trauma really well and just talking about how our body will hold trauma. And then there's another one that I recommend called Lost Connections, which is really interesting because he looks at like society as a whole and like things that might be playing a part into our mental health. And so
Wow.
things like being out in nature, being connected with community, moving our bodies a lot, like those are things that we kind of got out of the habit of doing. So I
Hmm.
just think it's really interesting how he was looking at like a lot of data there and comparing it. Cause I'm like, there's certain things that like maybe we should just be trying to do regularly, like being out in green space, connecting with other people, like those things just make us feel good. So I reference that one a lot. And then another one that I reference all the time is fierce self-compassion, which I think is something that most people struggle with, which is this idea of like self-compassion, being kind to ourselves. I think, 99% of my clients are struggling with being nice and kind to ourselves. So that book really kind of goes over specifically like what self-compassion looks like, being kind to ourselves. So I really
Wow.
like those nonfiction books. I also just read one this year called It's Not You. It's by Dr.
I
Uh,
read that too. I
yes,
read that too. Oh my
yeah,
gosh. Yes, it's not you and it's referencing oh my God,
narcissism.
narcissists.
Yes,
I just read that. Oh my gosh. What a kismet. That's insane.
yes.
I actually have a note about It's Not You because I read it that recently.
Hmm.
Um and it's you can also find it on Libby for listeners out there who have a library card. If your library does have it, you can find it on Libby. Which is great because if you want to save money, always use your library. But support the authors while you can get Audible too. Um, there was a quote from that book that literally blew my mind where it references narcissism, and there's different types of narcissism. And they say that consistent inconsistency, narcissism is consistent. However, there is an inconsistency to it. When a narcissist person is well regulated and feels they are in control and has sufficient narcissistic supply, for instance, work is going well, they're getting compliments, they're in a fun new relationship, or they just got a new car, they may be less antagonistic and more pleasant. Unfortunately, the narcissistic supply gets stale for them very quickly. So they always need more, new and better. Example, I'm having the best day ever. I just got a huge upgrade at work. I am the man. A few hours later, they are deeply upset and angry because their new relationship expressed need to reschedule dinner. It can turn that quickly. That's a quote directly from It's Not You, Identifying and Healing from Narcissistic People by Dr. Ramni Devolzia. I'm so sorry if I said their name wrong, but fine for my life with the speech impediment. But that book was amazing. Like,
Yeah.
whoa, who knew there were so many different types of narcissism and the way it can affect children, marriages, children who grow up and later try to find relationships or build friendships,
Mhm.
who are like traumatized from narcissism. That book hit me really hard, living with someone who was very narcissistic for a long time as a child. The need to feel loved and to feel seen, like how do you feel after reading that book? Do you feel like that could somehow help people who may be healing from narcissistic relationships in the family or in relationships romantically? What were your thoughts on it overall?
Yeah, I thought it was really well done. I thought there was a lot. I mean, I think part of this one also, especially with what I had talked about earlier, like you just don't feel alone anymore.
Yeah.
Because and I don't know if she specifically says this in this book or she has a podcast as well too, but
Oh, wow.
she said something like, when you are a survivor of narcissistic abuse, sometimes you feel like you were in a cult of one. Like you just didn't,
Mm.
you're kind of realizing everything for the first time. So I
Ooh,
think that it's very insightful for people to be like, "Oh, wow, this I wasn't alone." And then the way that she does in the end of the book, she has, realistic examples for living with the if you have the abuser in your life still, or however that looks for you, and without any judgment, like however you're going to have this person in your life, here are some tips and tools for like keeping them in your life, which I love because I'm like, not everybody can get rid of an abuser in their life. Some people have them around, and so how do you adjust your life accordingly? So I've used that with a lot of my clients, even ones that aren't necessarily dealing with narcissism, but this idea of like, how do I adjust myself and my own boundaries so that I can be healthiest when the people in my life may not be.
100%. I also think that sometimes in fiction books, the person's able to cut off a relative and walk away, which is amazing because in real life, some people can do that.
Mm-hmm.
But also in real life, like outside of the bookish page, people sometimes do have to, like, let's say it's an ex-husband and they have kids. They can't necessarily cut that person out. In some cases where like maybe the only way you can connect to the children is to still maintain a certain like co-parenting relationship. I'm an older sibling, so like I can relate to like you can't always just cut people out. Sometimes you do have to interact in the sake of like a younger child's involved. Like I said, these topics can be heavy, and I know some listeners may hear this and like get emotional or may feel like, man, that's me. But I agree with you, Camilla, where it's like you don't have to feel alone. So many people are like dealing with this stuff, be it
Mm-hmm.
like a narcissistic relative, or like a coworker or a boss, like someone who feels like they're in a position of power. It's a lot. It's very complex. We're not playing checkers, we're playing chess for sure. And yeah, the heart and the mind don't always agree, so it's tough.
Yeah.
And that's where therapists come in though. They help you kind of figure out how to navigate the best way I could describe is those games.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always direct, you know. So yeah, it's tough, but I loved your recommendation on that because I loved that book.
Mm-hmm.
I can that was a good book. So
Yeah.
yes, 100%. And I love that you referenced the author also has a podcast. That's so cool.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow, I didn't
I
know
dove
that.
into her a lot. She was actually a recommendation by my own therapist, which everyone should be in therapy, even therapists. So she recommended her to me. And so then I just kind of devoured everything that she's put out. So
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. All right. I will, like I said, I'm gonna list all the books that Camilla references in the show notes below, as well as my three fiction books as well. But yeah, let's keep going. So, Emily Henry, Allie Hazelwood, author recommendations from you, just for the summer as a fiction recommendation. And then we'll dive into the nonfiction ones. I'll just list them all below.
Hmm.
But yes, it's not you in reference to like narcissism and handling people who have narcissism and how to navigate that.
Hmm.
Great book.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Do you have a favorite author and why?
I think it is. So I have a couple that I kind of list as like my must buys or people that I've read like all of their books.
Okay.
It is I did so Emily Henry is one of them for sure, Allie Hazelwood. And then I also really love Kristen Hannah.
I've
I
heard of
haven't
her.
read all of hers yet, but like for every book that she's recommended, I like that she will pull in themes that you wouldn't necessarily think to read about. Like
Mm.
her book from last year that was really well reviewed as well.
The
That one,
women,
yeah, and that was
about
about
PTSD.
yes, yeah, and so it was about women nurses in Vietnam, which I didn't even know. I mean, like I knew they existed, but I never thought
Mhm.
about like, oh, what was their experience like? And so they had a lot of, I mean, and it just dives into all these deep themes of like, obviously the PTSD, but also this idea of like women at that time, they weren't really well accepted. So, she would go to the VA to try to get help and they'd be like, you don't have PTSD. You're a woman. Like, what did you deal with? So things like that, where like the patriarchy was fighting against them as well. So it was just, I really love how in most of her books, she will like have all these themes that are kind of underlying just this like big general issue of like, okay, nurses in Vietnam, and then there's like, oh, PTSD, there's the patriarchy, and she also somehow puts happy endings in her books, which is so funny because they're usually very sad as well.
Man, I have heard of the women. I've heard great things about the women. Fully Booked and Caffeinated, an amazing bookish podcast, an entire episode on the women and that amazing book.
Hmm.
Personally, for me, I think something I also wish more people talked about was that when you're reading certain books, especially after we leave school, like I'm in college right now, a
Hmm.
lot of people feel like they have to read certain genres in order to be included in the conversation, but they don't always consider how those books can affect their own mental health, such as
Hmm.
books that may discuss SA, abuse, PTSD, even references to like don't go in that area. We always go as a group in the case of the women because they were still women in a war zone and they were afraid of men and what
Hmm.
they could do. Even in like queer books, there's so much trauma as a black queer woman. There's often books I want to read, but I know that characters who look like me are treated horribly, or we go through like every traumatic experience you can think of. And I don't necessarily want to spend 12 hours listening to an audiobook about suffering.
Yeah.
Sorry. And I'm just sitting
Yeah.
here and I'm like, sometimes I wish more people discuss, like, I would read that, but I don't have the mental space and I don't want to be triggered and I don't want to be traumatized, or in some cases,
Mhm.
re-traumatized,
Yeah.
just to say I read it, just to say I know what happened, you know?
Yeah.
I wish more people talked about that. And I was curious if you've ever experienced that yourself, where you're like, you've read about a book or you've heard about it and you're like, I checked the trigger warnings and it references A, B, and C, and I'm not necessarily comfortable with reading that. Have you experienced
Mhm.
that before?
I So one of the things that I've actually been working on with myself is that I got into this place where I was like really scheduling what I'm reading, and it's based on like, oh, I have all these reading challenges and I want to make sure I'm reading this, this, and this. And so then like my reading was so scheduled and regimented that it wasn't actually like a fun thing anymore. And so
Mm,
that's one of the things that I'm actually like working on for myself is like instead of being like you have to read every single book a certain way or by a certain time, I'm trying to read just more for joy and pleasure. And so encapsulating that idea of just like picking up a book, and if it's not in my mood right now, I can just like place it back down and read it another time, because I feel like you can put a lot of pressure on yourself, especially with social media and things, and you're like, oh well,
mhm.
everyone's read this book so I have to read and have an opinion on it. And that's not necessarily true. So I'm trying to work on it for myself with like
Wow.
just reading things that I want to read in the moment instead of whatever someone recommended.
I also think that I love how you referenced checking in with yourself and
Hmm.
putting it down and taking breaks if needed.
Hmm.
Um, I definitely was. There are times when I read a book and someone covers like it's a metaphor. It's always a metaphor. But I'm sitting here and I'm like, this feels like it's about this, and the author will come out and be like, it was about that, and I'm like,
Yeah.
if I wanted to read that. I don't think I wanted to read that. You know, you don't have control of a lot of things in life, and then you do, and then you're overwhelmed by all the choices.
Hmm.
Sometimes when you read a book, you just want to know what happens. Like sometimes I think we read books and we know what's gonna happen. And it's like she's like, I work like a dog day and night. And she's like a full-time working mom, single mom, and she meets a hot farmer, and then bing bam boom, he's in love with her instantly. And they live in his expensive, beautiful farmhouse, and she never has to worry about anything ever again. Sometimes you just want to read like these fluffy, airy. The way I describe it on the podcast is like a cappuccino. You just want something that's 80% fluff, 2%
Hmm.
espresso, where there's like a heart deep, deep down, extra hot,
Yeah.
extra steamy. But then sometimes you want to read a book that's like a green tea where there's no spice. It really was about the story and it was about the characters. And you get to the
Hmm.
end of it and you feel like nutrients.
Yeah.
But either way, I'm like, my therapist described it as you know what you can handle, you know
Hmm.
where your boundaries are. It's okay to push, it's okay to challenge yourself, but after a certain point, you're just kind of pushing and pushing and pushing, and you have nothing left, and your cup is empty. So
Hmm.
sometimes reading things that fill you up, be it a spicy romance or a fantasy where you're whisked away to a faraway land, even a nonfiction where maybe you learn about how to navigate complicated relationships. So when something does happen, you have that in your toolbox of, okay, drawing a line. I no longer want to discuss this with you. I don't know if our relationship can survive this, A, B, and C.
Hmm.
But I feel like everyone receives something from books. Same thing with therapy. People decide to go into therapy. All it does is, if you have the right therapist, improve your life and give you the tools and resources to write a new chapter that maybe is what you really wanted. You know, maybe you didn't know that what you were experiencing was 100% normal, or
Hmm.
that you don't have to carry that trauma by yourself. There's ways to manage it and to navigate it. So, man, that brings me to a few books I wanted to bring up.
Yeah.
I only have two, but they were so good at navigating mostly anxiety, which I really struggle with. But I wanted to reference them in case readers haven't heard of them, or maybe they have and they didn't think it had that. I think you should read them. If you haven't heard of them, I highly recommend you read them. They're so good. These are two fiction books, but I really loved them. I already referenced one of my fiction recommendations, which is the That Time I Yeeted a Love Potion at a Werewolf by Kimberly Lemming. High
Hmm.
fantasy, super quick, amazing fantasy read. Also, it covers communication, consent, navigating intimacy, as well as just being open with your partner, open with your friends, and like communicating. This is a lot for me. I need support. That book did that beautifully.
Hmm.
Another book I want to reference, which is set in modern day, is The Neighbor Favor by Kristina Forrest. Annotated this puppy so much. I love this book with all my heart. But it navigates a male love interest who is struggling with childhood trauma, and he has to hide his identity as a famous author because he doesn't want his dad to find him. And it doesn't dive into like horrible like abuse, but it was more like his father used him in order to get the things he wanted as a child. And he would like say like, oh, break into this house and steal this. And the kid would not knowing would do certain things and then later find out his dad was using him. And that's why when he became a famous author, he changed his name, he didn't go to events, and then he meets the love of his life. He wants to tell her who he is, but he has this trauma and he has this fear of being found. Um,
Hmm.
so he eventually does overcome it, but his modern day relationship does get hurt because of his past and because of living with someone who was incredibly manipulative as a child. So now as an adult, he's trying to navigate that, find love again, love himself, and then maybe love someone else. So this was amazing. I loved this book. And I feel like it's so rare to find a love interest who doesn't know how to navigate something at first, but then finds like there is a way to love again, there is a way to heal again, and he does end up healing. So this was amazing. Love it so much. And then my last recommendation, this will surprise no one because I love this author with all my heart. She does disability rep really well. She does real life, but also she's like her fiction books feel so rooted in reality, but also so fluffy and warm. Like it kind of feels like coming home from a long day and like putting on your favorite clothes. And then you like touch the news and you're like, I don't want to read the news. And then you like go back to reading. This book is Next to You by Hannah Bonam Young. This
Hmm.
has female representation for anxiety. She does, throughout the book, at times kind of separate from her friends and loved ones to be in her own space alone to navigate her anxiety and her fears. But she ends up finding someone who's her friend, who later becomes more, and who always wanted to be more, may I add. He's also designed off Jason Momoa, so he's like just this big teddy bear who's super handsome and wonderful. And he's like, I've been flirting with you for a year. And she's like, what? He's like, I'm in love with you. So it's very and
Oh.
he's just like, my love language is tasks and love and everything. But he knows she has anxiety, so they're able to navigate it in a really beautiful way. And I've never read a book like that before, where like someone says like, I want to love you. She also, trigger warning, has lost her father, so she's dealing with grief over a long period of time. And he ends up sharing a story with her about his mom who lost a lot of her relatives all at once. And
Mm.
then the mom and the love interest end up sitting down together, and she's like, they're always with you. This is how you can navigate grief. This is how you can navigate anxiety. You need to slow down. And she does end up seeing like kind of the spirit of her father in the distance. And she's able to kind of heal through her grief. It's beautiful. So the love story is amazing, but like the healing is amazing too. So
I
I
love
love
that.
this book so much. So yeah, those are my three fiction recommendations. So let's dive into yours. Were there any books you didn't get a chance to reference where you're like, everyone needs to know about this, please?
I'm reading this one right now that I actually think is going to, I haven't finished it yet, so
Okay.
it could end really badly. But I'm reading, oh, it's like How Not to End a Love Story or How to End a Love Story.
I've never
And
heard of that.
it's really interesting. It won one of the Goodreads awards, which is what like tracked me on it. I think she's a debut author.
Ooh,
Um,
okay. I
and
do
it's
not
really
know that
interesting
story.
because the main character has lost her sister by suicide. Trigger warning for that. And the love interest or the guy that comes, he actually hit her sister um, with his car. So they have this connection with each other, and then they see each other again. And as you can imagine, both of them have a very unhealed past with this whole situation that came up. So, there's a lot of grief in there. There's a lot of trauma, and it is really the way that it's been navigated so far, I think is really beautiful. They're both, well, one of them at least is in therapy. So I'm just like, I love
Mm.
that so far it seems to be handling it in a very realistic way. And so I haven't finished it yet, but I think it is going to be good. Yeah.
That sounds amazing. I'm like listening to you talk about it and I'm like, dang, that sounds good. Speaking of healing from the loss of a sibling,
Hmm.
there's a book I'm planning to read this year. It's actually it's on my like it's right here. It was on my bookshelf. This whenever I look at a book and I'm like, mm-hmm, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
My room is covered in books, dear God. But
Yeah. Same.
there's actually you just reminded me of two books where I'm like, okay, mental health rep. But it doesn't all wrap up like in a way where it's like everything's perfect and nothing hurts me anymore. That's not
Hmm.
always the case. This book is actually book two. It's a long time coming. The first book is A Thousand Boy Kisses by Tillie Cole,
Okay.
which references someone who has cancer and is navigating kind of end of life planning. And she
Mm-hmm.
knows like after a certain point, like this is what's gonna happen. And it flips between her point of view and her childhood crush's point of view, and like him coming back to town, him discovering she was sick, and how they're trying to navigate this jar her grandma gave her where she can fill it with all these notes of 1,000 kisses she's had in a lifetime.
Okay.
And her goal is to get those 1,000 kisses from her childhood crush, and he's willing to do it as well. But does she have enough time?
Mm.
And it's not this like intense adventure. It's more like just trying to make the most of the days, trying to navigate this loss of like a life you could have had. Healing as well, a lot of miscommunication. Even though it's considered a young adult book, it does cover a lot of adult themes. And it was an amazing book. Like I cried. The audiobook was insane. The physical book's great, but the
Yeah.
audiobook, she has a southern accent, and then he has, I think, is it like Norwegian? He has a really thick accent. So the audiobook did it really well.
Okay.
But that book, trigger warning, does reference the death of a sibling and then also the grief of like her parents after a little
Mm-hmm.
bit. So that was a book where I read it. My good friend Samantha recommended it to me. She was like, "This is such an impactful book." So, A Thousand Boy Kisses was one of those. But this book is the second book in that story, which I was not expecting, which follows her younger sister after the loss of her the main character from book one,
Okay.
which is A Thousand Broken Pieces by Tillie Cole.
Okay.
This book navigates the younger sister's healing from the grief of her older sister from book one, and she ends up meeting someone who's also navigating trauma, and they become friends during a road trip. And the love story, from what I've been told, I can't wait to read this, but from what I've been told, is more of a slow burn, but
Mm-hmm.
also two people navigating forms of grief and loss and changes in life and how they want to approach it. So I'm looking forward to reading this one. But you mentioned something you were currently reading, and I was like, I'm planning on reading this one. And I know
Yeah.
this will touch on some mental health in relation to grief.
Yeah.
Um, I have another book that I currently have in my stack, but I'm gonna reference it, which is A Love Song for Ricki Wilde, by Tia Williams. I'm currently reading that one. There's the main character, Ricki, her name is Richard. She's named after her father because he's like my last child would have my name. He's a daughter and he's like your name will be Richard. So she's like okay. So everyone calls her Ricki. But she has social anxiety and she also throughout the book, light spoiler, she has flashbacks of like her childhood and you realize that like her mom had she has older siblings and the older siblings had this expectation of being perfect socially, going into this family business, kind of following the social rules. You dress like this, you do this, they're in high society. And she's really into plants and botany. She's really into being outside. Her family's not supportive of her hobbies.
Mm-hmm.
Her father's very dismissive. If you don't do this business, good luck doing your own thing, like not supportive at all. And she has this flashback of trying to put on like her mom's clothes and like act like her mom. And her mom sees this and immediately like throws her in the shower and she like tries to wash her off and her mom starts crying. She's like, "You're playing with me. Like you're acting like me." And she thought she was joking in a bad way. And this
Mm-hmm.
child was just trying to impress her mom and trying to be accepted. And the mom lashed out instead of being
Mm-hmm.
supportive. And we see how that impacts her adult life, how she finds romantic relationships, nothing serious, her seeking out friends, bringing up random quotes where she's like, this is a fun fact. This is a fun fact. And she's trying to like repress herself a lot.
Mhm.
But she ends up meeting someone who understands her. And at one point he says, she's like, I'm sorry, that was a dumb quote. He's like, maybe you've just been telling the quotes to the wrong people. Because that's
Mm,
actually not dumb. And like he references, like, I know a lot about that too. And she's finally like seen and accepted and like cared about, but not just by him. She's also cared about by her older neighbor, who's more like a mother figure, who's this like older
mhm,
grandmother figure who's very loving and accepting of her. She meets a friend who they're like both kind of outcasts. And like this is one of the first books I've ever read where I'm not trying to finish it for the sake of finishing it. I'm trying
mhm.
to read it to experience it and enjoy it. And like, if something hits me really deeply, I'm like letting it sit instead of being like, well, that was great writing. On to the next chapter. Like it's,
Yeah.
especially like, I'm so curious. Have you ever met someone who's like an older sibling, who's been like, you know what? I have A, B, and C to complete, and I will complete A, B, and C. And anything I feel, I can just feel later. I'll prioritize it for later, like
Mm,
compartmentalizing. Um, I felt that while reading this book. I definitely self like this is I'm not a doctor, but like, I self-diagnosed and I was like, I think I have trauma because of, and I'm like, I'm not a doctor, but yeah, I feel like books can help us navigate our own problems and then bring them up in therapy and say, this book made me feel this way, can you help me navigate that? So that was another
yeah.
book where I'm reading it and I'm like, oh God, this is starting to hit, this is starting to hit a little
Yeah.
too close to home. Oh God. I wanted to bring that up with you because I'm currently reading it. I've been reading it for like a
Uh-huh.
month. And I've been trying to take my sweet time 'cause this puppy hurts. I'm like, oh, this hurts.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like I went to the doctor and I got a shot, and then I'm like, oh, at least it was one. And they're like, you actually have 3 shots left. And I'm like, oh gosh, looks like I'm getting chicken pox. I'm not taking that. So, but yeah, that book is beating me up. It's beating me up. So I'm fighting for my life here. But yeah, the book you referenced, I'm like, I feel like that's gonna beat you up too, for lack of a better word. I feel like that's gonna get you
Yes.
emotionally. So yes,
Yeah.
but that was one where I was like, I have to tell you about it. It's so good. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hope you read it. I do. I'm in
Sounds
pain. Also, I highly recommend it.
good.
I highly recommend it.
I
Yes.
love it.
So my
Yeah.
last question for you is, do you have any tips for listeners out there struggling with burnout or anxiety as we enter the new year? Any book recommendations?
Yes, I think one of the biggest things that, and this kind of comes up naturally for everybody, like I don't think any of my clients set New Year's goals, but we still talked about goals because it's the new year and that's kind of like what people think and talk about. So I
Yeah.
think one of the things that I always tell people is to set small, realistic, accomplishable goals for yourself. So if you have like a general goal of, everyone wants to get fit. So like go to the gym 7 days a week. Don't start
Hmm.
by saying I'm going to go to the gym 7 days a week. Start by saying I'm going to make a schedule for myself. I'm going to go 1 day a week. And so when you start doing that regularly, then you can move up to two. And so just doing this so that way you're not overwhelming yourself and also not beating yourself up if you don't make it happen. So that's why I think like when we look at goals, making them a lot smaller and just realistic and being kind to ourselves no matter what those goals look like. Um, and then just making sure that as you're going about your lifetime, trying to find time for self care, but not the like generic, like take a bath self care, like actual
Hmm.
genuine self care. So, what makes you feel like your cup is filled? Even if it's something that's kind of hard, like sometimes connection feels really good, but it's really hard to like do because you have to reach out to somebody or you have to
Hmm.
set up plans. So making sure that you're getting that time for yourself where you are like genuinely filling your cup for yourself or resting despite what your to-do list might look like. Yeah, and if you have the opportunity to find a therapist, it's always great to do the work with someone that's a professional, and not just taking any therapist. I mean, I think it's so important to, and sometimes we don't talk about this, but you can interview therapists and you should interview therapists. This is
Wow.
someone that you're like supposed to trust.
Hmm.
So they should offer you some sort of intro session where you can meet and talk to them and ask them questions. And if you don't feel comfortable with them, find another one. Find someone that you connect with that you feel like I can accomplish my goals with them.
Wow, that was amazing. I'm so grateful for your time going through all of these books with me, listing off your recommendations. Just to review, listeners, some of the books that you referenced were Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez, How to Not End a Love Story by Yulin Kuang, who I found was able to find online.
Hmm.
And then author recommendations was Emily Henry, Ali Hazelwood, Kristen Hannah. In reference to PTSD rep and historical fiction, we have The Women by Kristen Hannah. Were there any other books you want to recommend before we end this episode?
There's one that will always hold a spot in my heart for me, which is the book called Lilly and the Octopus. It's by, I think it's Stephen Rowley. I think that's his name. And that book is so beautiful. It's about the loss of a pet. And I think it's just a very beautiful representation of it because I think sometimes when we think about the loss of a pet, we're not always, it's kind of like a disenfranchised grief where we're like, oh, it's just a dog or it's just a cat.
Mhm.
But this shows that true connection that you can have, that bond and the beauty of your connection with your pets. And I have dogs, so I loved it. I cried. It was just a beautiful book.
Wow. I have a cat, Midnight. He's my like unofficial co-host. I'm
Hmm.
surprised he's not here right now. He's probably sleeping because he's supposed to be nocturnal. Anyway, so he I always cry and I get really emotional. I see him right now. He's in the pillows. He's asleep. But I was like, where is he? But I see him. He's in the pillows. He's resting. But I think that's another thing where like people sometimes like I read a book and I'm like, oh my God, those big feelings. So my dad always calls them big feelings. But like those big feelings, a lot of people feel very passionately about certain things. And there's nothing wrong with being like, you know what? Like the lo thinking about the loss of a pet brings me to tears. But I can watch the news for an hour and feel sadness, but I'm not like to my knees, like God, you know what I mean? But the
Hmm.
loss of a creature who's so happy to see you every day who
Hmm.
you may have had for years through multiple different life changes, it makes sense why you would grieve. And it makes sense why that attachment and that consistency, once it's gone, it's like, it,
Yeah.
the sound, and I don't mean to sound bleak, but I think it's sometimes important to acknowledge, like, in adulthood, like navigating life in general, sometimes we just need that, like, comfort or that, like, that childhood warmth.
Hmm.
Do you feel that where like you're like, I need this ice cream after a long day, or like I want to watch this 20-year-old rom-com that I watched when I was 15 because when I watch it, everything's great in the world. Like, do you have anything like that where you're like, man, like I read this book and it reminded me of something I myself do, or I'm currently navigating?
Yeah, there was this book called This Time Tomorrow by Emma, I think it's Emma Straub, and it reminded me of, I grew up in the 90s and it was very much like a reminiscent of the 90s, like having a dad that maybe is trying to figure out how to be a dad, and it felt very much like a Blockbuster Video back in the 90s, which is just such a weird like reminiscent feeling, but it made me feel
Ooh.
like very cozy. And just as I'm figuring out my own parenting, kind of like a lot of reflections on parenting, and I loved it. It was very reminiscent and warm and fuzzy in some spaces, and also just tackling all the other fun parenting things too.
What? You brought up parenting, and there was a book, I feel like I wish everyone would read it because I found it through my library and it was amazing. It was a series of short stories about disability love
Mm,
and loving people with disabilities. If you yourself are struggling with a disability, be it physical, mental, emotional, anything, it was a book about all these authors and how they navigate their disabilities in their relationships, be it
mhm,
romantic, parental, with maybe with a friend. There was, I'm gonna pull up the title because it was so good. I read it last year and I'm thinking about reading it again because it
mhm,
was like sometimes you need to read things multiple times to really appreciate it.
mhm.
But I was like, man, I was reading it and I was like, this is like a really, really good book. But I think it's one of those things where like sometimes I read short stories and they're incredibly short, but they cover so much and they're actually really deep. And I'm like,
Yeah.
man, like I could read an entire book about this. But
Mhm.
it was called like disability. I think it was like disability, like loving disabilities. It was something like that. It was something like
Mm,
that. And I remember reading it and being like, man, this was so, oh, it's called Disability Intimacy, Essays on Love, Care, and Desire. It was only
wow.
384 pages. It was super short. The
Mm,
audiobook was 11 hours and 21 minutes. And my favorite stories were Disabled Queer Love Exists by T. Franklin, Love and Care Unspooling by Nicole Lee, Schroeder, and The Most Valuable Thing I Can Teach My Kid Is How to Be Lazy by Elliot Kukla. The
Mm.
last story, when I read that, the author references how in their disability they have to rest a lot of the time, and they were scared that would impact like their ability to raise their child. Where this is a very quick summary, but like at one point they realized them and the kid would like make like nests together of blankets and pillows, and they would sleep and take naps together.
Mm.
And I was like, man, that's good. And then there was a quote that really dove into this idea of, navigating love in a way that benefits both people instead of this form of where I read a lot in books where it's like, I will sacrifice, I will give up everything,
Yeah.
I will live on this term for you.
Hmm.
I preferred where I was like, I wish I read more books where it was about finding a middle and like compromise. And I was
Yeah.
like, I feel like I never hear about that anymore, about like compromising in relationships, compromising in like friendships. Like I just felt like I wasn't reading that anymore. And I was like, man, like
Hmm.
especially like parenting, I was like, oh, I wish there was more books about like adult relationships like, between like an adult and their adult parent. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? Like that, I wish there were more books about that. And I don't, maybe I just haven't seen them. But I was like, do you have any recommendations for people who are like adults and like navigating like being with their parents or like navigating adult friendships? I feel like that there's just nothing about that anymore. I'm like, what's
Yeah.
going on?
Yeah, we really
Yeah.
need that. I think you're
Don't
right.
don't you? Yeah, like you're sitting here and you're
Yeah.
like, I know so many adults who don't know how to make friends because or
Hmm.
they don't know where to find a friend. And maybe
Hmm.
they're married and they're like, well, I don't want to, I'm not looking for another romantic, but I'm looking for a friend.
Yeah.
It's like your entire adulthood, you're making friends through school
Hmm.
or like through your neighborhood. Like it was all about like being around, just being in the area. And now it's like that we're older. It's like we're overwhelmed by all these choices. TV shows, 1,000 choices, food, 1,000 choices, places to live, 1,000 choices. Making a friend who understands you. Like,
Hmm.
how are you supposed you can't order that on Amazon. Like, you have to like go out in the world and like be vulnerable. And I'm like, oh no.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I
That's
do
true.
you feel that? I don't know. I feel like that's even for parents. I read a book called Night
Yeah.
Bitch recently with a friend. The mom was going through postpartum. She didn't feel like she could make any friends. Like she was
Hmm.
very isolated. I was like, where could
Yeah.
she make friends? She ended up making friends through mommy and like child group where they would play music for the kids and the moms ended up becoming friends, but that was because of vicinity. It
Yeah.
wasn't a purposeful, I will go out today and
Yeah.
I will make a friend. Like it
Yes.
so yeah,
Yeah,
I don't
you know, and I
know.
do want to put a plug out there. I do think one of the beautiful things about reading, like even though it is such an isolating thing, like you do it and you sit by yourself and you read, obviously. I have joined a couple book clubs and I have found that it's like a really amazing way to connect with people that you have similar interests with and speaking about. And I actually recommend it to my clients a lot, especially my reader clients, where I'm like, go join a book club. Like even if they have this thing called Silent Book Club, at least in Michigan where
I
I'm
go to
at.
those too. I go to those
Yeah,
as well.
they're
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah, and you
They're
just
pretty
sit
great.
and you quietly read. And so I tell some of my clients, like, okay, you don't like want to have a social experience, then go to a silent book club, and eventually maybe you'll see that someone's reading the same book as you, and
Yeah.
you can talk about it. Like these are organic ways that
Yeah.
we can talk. And so I do think like even though reading is solitary, there are ways to like make connections through book clubs, which is always fun,
Hmm.
or creating your own and like finding like-minded people that way. The first thing I did, I moved to a new area, and the first thing I did was to see if there was a book club, and I found one. And it's been really fun so far. So just trying to find other ways to connect with people through reading. Obviously there's the book blogging and being online with books, but also there are things out in the community sometimes that you can do too.
It's a good idea. I should have referenced I found a book club in my area as well. And like even though it's a silent book club and we're all reading different things,
Yeah.
they sometimes do take breaks where you can talk to people. And a
Hmm.
lot of people will end up coming up to you, or like you can find something to talk about. My rule of thumb, whenever trying to make a new friend, this has really helped me. Whenever I'm trying to make a new friend, I always try to find at least one thing we have in common. So be
Hmm.
it like, hey, I noticed we're both at the same coffee shop. What do you tend to order? I'm non-dairy, so I end up getting oat milk a lot. I noticed you got oat milk too. Like little things like that. Also like as scary as it may be, like life changes. Sometimes you lose friends due to life changes, be it maybe you get into a relationship with someone and they don't agree. Friendships overall. Or like there's maybe times in life where you move apart and things just happen. You don't talk for a few months. Um,
Hmm.
But sometimes I feel like one door closes, another one opens. Sometimes you make a new
Yeah.
friend when you said goodbye to another friend, like
Hmm.
little things like that. So, book clubs are amazing. Also, for people out there who do want to get into the fitness life, but they're trying to find like community events, look for a running club. Sometimes you don't have
Hmm.
to be a runner right away. You can just walk, and then you end up meeting people who are also walking.
Hmm.
Um, I always think that's so cool. So I don't know. I just it's little things like that where I'm like, I like this. I might give this a
Yeah.
try. Um,
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Camilla, for coming onto this episode and for sharing your bookish recommendations. You are wonderful. Where can everyone find you?
So I have my therapy bookstagram is books and therapy, and then I believe there's an underscore on my jam. And so
That's so cool.
yeah, that's my official online. And I don't really have anything else anymore. TikTok is obviously gone as of today. I was
Yeah,
trying to
that
do
was
that a little
rough.
bit, but yeah,
Ooh,
it's
oh,
so
it's
yes,
giving, what is it? Dystopian. Oh
yes,
gosh, it's giving
yeah.
Divergent. Oh God. So
It's very strange.
it's
Yeah,
very strange. Yeah, how quick it just cut out like that. Spooky, spooky.
yeah.
But Bookstagram, that's where I live as well. Yes, I'm happy that everyone can find you. I will link your Instagram below too, so people can find you on there as well. But
Awesome.
thank you so much for coming on this episode. I'm so grateful you were
Yeah,
here.
thank you for having me.
100%. So thank you for everyone for listening. If you're listening on YouTube, you can like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, leave a comment, show some love. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.